Whilst I may be critical of a lot of what GNOME does in both the project and the foundation, I try to at least focus on the things that actually matter, instead of all that nonsense off to the side that, look, might be fun to rant about in a Discord chat, might be fun to make memes about, but frankly just doesn't matter at the end of the day. And in a big way, the discussion around the GNOME Foundation Executive Director as of late had kinda just been focused on the nonsense and nothing that actually matters. Now, unless you live under a rock or for some other reason just don't pay attention to Linux news, you're probably aware in the past year the GNOME Foundation got a new executive director. But let's step back to the prior one. From 2017 to 2022, Neil McGovern was the executive director. This was not on his first attempt though, he ran for the position twice in a row. Now, prior to being the executive director, he was leading the Debian project, taking over from Lucas Nussbaum in 2016, and did that position for about a year or so before also stepping down from that. He had also in the past held a board position at the Software for Public Interest along with the Open Rights Group, and by that point had been in the open source and Linux space for about 20 or so years. He was someone who, if you were paying at least a bit of attention, you probably had at least a surface level knowledge of. You might have seen him in a mailing list before, or maybe in an issue tracker reporting a bug, maybe doing some bug triaging, or fixing a bug himself. Maybe you'd seen him in a talk at one of the various Linux conferences doing some free and open source software advocacy. Maybe if you're a Debian user, you actually know who is running the project and you realized, hey, he was the project leader for a short period of time. He was someone who was a known element and didn't really need much explanation on why he was running the GNOME Foundation. Now, Neil stepped down in 2022 and the GNOME Foundation went without an executive director for about a year or so. Following this, Neil ended up being replaced by who you may know as the current director, or was the current director, Holly Million. Now, here's the thing. I don't really have an opinion on Holly's work as an executive director because I have seen barely anybody actually talk about what she did or what she didn't do. Was she a good director? I don't know, it's possible. I have no idea, because almost all of the discourse was focused on her work as a professional shaman. Yes, this is real, this is not disputed whatsoever, but also it doesn't matter. She wasn't brought on to do crystal healing or smoke ceremonies or summoning totems to buff the party. She was brought on to provide a different perspective on running a foundation from outside of the FOSS world, because everybody else involved in the GNOME Foundation has a long history in the FOSS world. They understand the FOSS component. They don't need more guidance on how to do things in the FOSS space. But they might need some guidance on doing that monetary part, that part that's just a little bit more challenging. I've seen some people say, oh, the shamanism stuff is snake oil and that's bad, she's scamming people. And you know what I have to say to that? Look, I don't care. If two adults agree to sign a contract and agree to exchange currency for a service, and you get the service that you paid for, I don't care if that service is snake oil. It frankly doesn't matter to me. The only thing that actually matters to me is, in the position you are in right now, are you doing a good job? And it's really hard to make that assessment with Holly because, I'm going to say it, I think the GNOME Foundation did Holly a giant disservice by not making more posts like this one here. Exciting updates on the GNOME Development Initiative and Sovereign Tech Fund. In this post, it talks about how Holly was basically being like a liaison between GNOME and the Sovereign Tech Fund, and discussing how the project's going, discussing how the funding is being used, potentially trying to bring more funding on, and things that are actually important to a foundation. Or we have this post from Robert McQueen talking about how Holly was brought on to basically help balance the foundation's books, develop new funding strategies to ensure that the spending they want to do is actually sustainable, rather than building up these giant reserves and then burning through all the reserves and suddenly having to cut back everything because you don't actually have a funding strategy to keep that actually possible. Or other other things like increasing the size of the board so there's more voices involved in the Foundation to try and resolve these problems to make sure they don't happen again in the future. With Neil McGovern, you didn't really need to do any additional work. People knew what he was about. People knew his experience. People knew why it made sense for him to be running the GNOME Foundation. But with Holly, she was this new element. People didn't really know who she was or why she was here. Why is she the executive director? What is her experience actually going to do in this position? By people in the Foundation and people involved in the project not talking more about her day-to-day operations. What does the executive director actually do? Why was she brought on to this position? What does her prior experience have to do with actually doing this role? What projects were started by Neil McGovern that maybe couldn't have been finished, or maybe they didn't have resources to do, or they didn't really know the best way to approach it, that Holly actually improved upon, that, hey look, now we can actually do this funding strategy. How has the funding been improved? How have the books been better balanced? And, the things that actually matter in a foundation. By not talking more about these things, what was allowed to happen is people that just didn't care about what Holly was doing in the Foundation. The only thing they cared about is the one thing that didn't matter to completely control the narrative. Let's imagine this in a different context. Let's say we're talking about Meta and Mark Zuckerberg, and there was never any talk about what Meta did and the data collection, how you generally shouldn't trust what Meta is doing as a company. And the only thing that you knew about Mark Zuckerberg wasn't anything he did in the company, any things he signed off of. The only thing you knew about is that he likes smoked meats and Sweet Baby Ray's barbecue sauce.
I'm making meats now. Smoking these meats here. Our little meat smoking. It's smoking. So, I'm the meat chef. Sweet Baby Ray's barbecue sauce. That is going on the ribs.
And did jujitsu. You would have a very different perspective of Mark Zuckerberg and his role at the company. The part that doesn't matter at all. However, going forward, Holly is no longer going to be the executive director, as announced recently. Her final day is going to be on July 31st, and right now they don't have a new long-term director lined up. Instead, they have an interim director, that being Richard Lawtoner, who will talk about what he does in just a moment. And as you'd expect from a PR piece like this, Holly does provide a quote. "I'm very proud of what I've accomplished in my time with GNOME, and I'm dedicated to working with Richard through a transition to ensure that everything I've been working on is handed off smoothly. I will be pursuing a PhD in psychology and dedicating myself to my own private practice. I want to thank all the wonderful people I've had the pleasure of connecting with here at GNOME, including the staff, board, advisors, founders, and volunteers. You have created something of real value in the world, and I look forward to seeing what you do next." Which is, of course, very PR speak, and I have absolutely no doubt in my mind that part of the reason she is stepping down is just not wanting all of the negative attention she has been getting. On behalf of the whole GNOME community, the board of directors would like to give our utmost thanks to Holly for her achievements during the past 10 months, including drafting a bold 5-year strategic plan for the Foundation, securing 2 important fiscal sponsor agreements with GIMP and Black Python devs, writing our first funding proposal that will now enable the Foundation to apply for more grants, vastly improving our financial operations, and implementing a break-even budget to preserve our financial reserves. Before we move on, let's just look back through the press releases. So we have this one of Holly leaving. Before that, we have the 5-year strategic plan. There's one about Black Python devs. And then there's Holly joining. There's not one in here about GIMP. I don't know why that's not there. I didn't even know that had actually happened. Before we move on, let's just talk about the lack of GNOME press releases. So we have the latest one, the one we're looking at about Holly leaving. Okay. Before that is the 5-year strategic plan. This is great, more of this. And then before that is the Black Python devs. Also great, more of that. Then it's Holly joining. So between October 17th and July 12th, there is only 2 press releases about what Holly is doing. And these are both great press releases. But why isn't there one about GIMP being an important fiscal sponsor? Or this one here? Or this one here, or this one here. It looks like over the 10 months that she was the executive director, this is the only thing that she did. There is clearly more work being done, they just weren't talking about it. Okay, so who is Richard Lautner and what does he do? Firstly, he is an organizer of Sustain OSS and Curious. The first one being about creating sustainable, long-running open source projects, bringing more people in, bringing more funding in, basically just making a project actually viable. The second is about connecting universities and research institutions together to work on common open source project goals instead of all just working in their own little silos. He's also been a sustainability coordinator at the Open Source Initiative. The Open Source Initiative is to open source what the FSF is to free software. He's been a community development manager at the Open Source Collective. Open Source Collective is kind of like Patreon, but more focused around foundations and open source projects. And he's also made contributions to many open source projects like Node.js, IPFS, and here is his GitHub, so if you want to go look back through other things he's got involved in, go and do so. He also has a really cool looking dog, so that also gets a thumbs up from me. Now, considering GNOME in the past, even before Holly, has been without an executive director before, I don't know how long he is going to be the interim director for. I don't know if he has other commitments and he can only do it for a short amount of time or what the deal is going to be, but the board will be holding a meeting next week to set up a search plan for the permanent executive director, which will be announced after Guadec. I'm sure there are some names floating around internally, but I'm not aware of anyone who has officially stepped up and said, I have an interest in taking over this position. Now, the thing with Richard is, much like with Neil McGovern, his qualifications basically speak for themselves. You can see what he has done and you're like, okay, this makes sense why he is in this position. I really hope that whoever they bring on as the permanent director, if it doesn't end up being Richard himself, if it is someone like Holly who doesn't have a clear direct connection to the open source space, I really, really hope they learn from the way that Holly was treated and actually talk more about what the person is doing, why they're the director, what's actually being achieved, instead of just waiting until the end and then it's like, hey, they did all these other things, oh, they're gone now, enjoy. Now you could say, oh, it's so bad that people on the internet are mean and oh, they shouldn't talk about people like this. Yeah, maybe it is. The thing is though, that's not going to change by sitting there and complaining about it. People are going to focus on the things that they think are important. So if there are things you actually want people to focus on, you know, like what the person's actually doing in the role and why they are here, it needs to be talked about much, much more frequently. But what do you think? Let me know your thoughts down below. Did you care at all about the shaman thing? Do you think that Richard is going to be a good interim director? Do you hope they actually talk about the next director more frequently so you know what they're actually doing? I would love to know. So if you liked the video, go like the video. And if you really like the video and you want to become one of these amazing people over here, check out the Patreon, subscribe to the Libero Pay linked in the description down below. That's going to be it for me, and I'll be the next director.